a yes, we're recording the meeting, by the way. Dr. Simpson is a plant ecologist at the University of Sheffield, where she studies the dynamics of how the environment influences plant traits, and then how those plant traits then feed back to influence the environment. So very topical for us GSI folks. She completed her PhD at Sheffield in 2018 with Colin Osborne on how exposure to fire influences grass functional traits in tropical grasslands. And then she's currently following that up with a postdoc, also at Sheffield, investigating the drivers of Savannah degradation in collaboration with Rhodes University in South Africa. So somebody spent a lot of time thinking about the various complex ways that ecosystems are responding to environmental change. So we're very lucky to have her here to take us through her various investigations to find the culprits behind woody encroachment in global savannas, which is a massively important global ecological shift. So please join me in giving a virtual welcome to Kim Simpson. Thank you, and over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Guy. So I'm going to talk about savanna degradation today, and I'm going to do it within the framework of Whodunnit, or a murder mystery, if you're unfamiliar with that phrase. So I'd like to invite you to join me over the next hour to do a bit of mystery solving in the case of the Vanishing Savannas, and you can insert your own dramatic music there. So let's first of all meet the victim in this case, and as you probably guessed, it is savannas. So this is a vegetation type that is distinguished by the presence of two contrasting life forms. So that is a very low density of C3 savanna trees, which have very open canopy and let lots of light through, and also a continuous layer of C4 grasses underneath. Savannas are really widespread and occur under hot, seasonally dry climates, and they evolved and expanded under low carbon dioxide concentrations 3 to 8 million years ago. And since that time, they've been maintained as this coexistence of grasses and trees, and that is despite large areas of savanna having the climatic potential to support forest. And that is because of a few key processes. So first of all, there is really intense competition for water and nutrients in these environments. So I've already mentioned that they're seasonally dry, and savanna soils are also typically nutrient poor as well. So for tree seedlings trying to establish in this grassy layer, there is really intense competition, and that means that recruitment is a rare event. Once these trees do become established, they then have to contend with really frequent disturbance. So in terms of fire, savannas have experienced some of the most frequent fire on Earth. And that is because of this grassy layer, which fuels this fire. A lot of these species that survive and then resprout after fire, so it really maintains this really high fire frequency. And these trees are susceptible to top killing from fire. So if they're caught within this kind of fire trap, they then have to start again, resprouting from the base, and they kind of have this state that's maintained by fire. And it's only really when the period of time between fires is long enough to allow these trees to grow tall enough and escape this fire trap and reach maturity and a state that's independent of fire. And similarly for herbivory, these trees are susceptible to herbivory when they're small, and it's only really when they can grow tall enough and beyond the reach of browsers can they really become mature. And fire and herbivory really represent, significant demographic bottlenecks in this environment. I mentioned that savannas are really widespread, so they cover 20% of the Earth's terrestrial surface, and that's highlighted in the yellow areas on this graph. And with that, they're also really diverse in terms of rainfall, temperature, edaphic factors, herbivory, species present. So they're really diverse, and the photos at the bottom here really show some of that diversity. And the one thing that really links all these together is this co-occurrence or coexistence of trees and grasses. So on to the crime itself, and that is that these savannas are disappearing. So this very delicate balance between these grasses and trees is becoming distorted and is kind of going in the direction of favour towards the trees and away from the grasses. And this is having some really stark and quite rapid effects. So, and that's really demonstrated in these this series of photos here. So this is a site in South Africa, and you can see the photo of this landscape that was taken in the 1950s, and really shows a very open landscape with just a sort of a smattering of trees. And within half a century, it's really been transformed with lots of big increases in woody cover and big increases in shrubs. So there's essentially a thicket now. And this isn't a problem that's occurring at one or two sites. This is really a phenomenon that's happening really widespread. And this is encroachment, and it's known by different things. It's known as woody thickening or bush encroachment. And in this talk, I'll just refer to it as encroachment. So this figure shows how woody vegetation cover is changing in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see, whilst there is some areas where woody cover is declining, so that's the red areas on this figure, overall the picture is pretty green, showing some big increases in woody cover in many places. But really this is very spatially variable. But overall the picture is that woody cover is increasing. It's also not a problem that's just isolated to the African continent. It's happening in savannas across the world. So this is a figure from a meta-analysis led by Nikki Stevens in Oxford. And the blue points on this figure show increases in woody cover. And whilst we can see there's a few red points showing decreases, overall the picture is of increasing woody cover in these savanna ecosystems. So we should pause for a moment here and really think about what the implications are of encroachment. And I feel like this photo here really tells 1,000 words about what encroachment means on the ground itself. So first of all, thinking from a human perspective, we see a reduction in the ability to forage. So this increase in woody cover shades out the grasses and means there's less available for grazing animals. With these trees are extracting more water and from greater depths, so there's implications for groundwater availability. This photo is very effective at showing how encroachment impacts on visibility in these landscapes as well as mobility through them. And linked with this is ecotourism. So people go on safari and they want to see the big five, and they don't want to see just a load of thorny bushes. There are some positives from this. So with more trees, there's more fuel wood, and there is also potential positive impacts for carbon sequestration as well. But these implications are considerable, and this is made particularly important when we consider that around 20% of the human population depend directly upon savannas for ecosystem service provision. And particularly when we consider that within that 20% is many of the world's poorest people. Thinking about it from the perspective of other animals as well. So encroachment really threatens a myriad of species that are endemic to and reliant on these open ecosystems. And this is just one example, and there's a really growing literature on this. But this just shows how the density of 6 different herbivore species, how their density changes with increasing woody cover. And you can see in the majority of these cases, we see a reduction going from left to right as woody cover increases. Okay, so that is the crime, and let's now move on to the suspects that are really driving encroachment. And when we go through and consider these, we should think about these characteristics. So we know that the suspect is having some impacts on this relative competitive ability of trees and grasses. So it's going to be something that is facilitating an increase in tree competitive ability, or a decrease in grass competitive ability, or a bit of a combination of the two. We know from this figure that I showed earlier that that this is something that's working on local scales, because we can see this huge spatial variability. And we also know that encroachment is happening across multiple continents, and so it's really something that's also happening at a global scale too. So with these things in mind, let's go on to the suspects. So first of all, suspect 1 is reduced fire frequency. So fires are reducing, fires are declining across the world, and this is particularly true in savannas, where things like habitat fragmentation and conversion to cropland and very intensive grazing is really impacting these fire regimes and causing a reduction in fire frequency. So this figure shows burnt area trends over the last few decades, with the more bluer colours indicating greater declines in burnt area over that time frame. And we can see that the blue areas really correspond to places in the world where we know that there are savannas, and that's further emphasised in this inset panel here, where we can see burnt area trend against tree cover, and we can see that some of the biggest reductions in burnt area are where tree cover is low, like in the case of savannas. So what does this mean? What does this reduction in fire frequency mean for grass-tree coexistence? So first of all, thinking about the grasses themselves. So these really thrive under frequent fire. So as a fire moves through the landscape, grasses tend, all above ground material tends to be removed for these grasses, and then they're able to resprout from basal meristems. And this resprouting is supported by the presence of storage organs below the ground. These species tend to be really shade intolerant, and so don't really tolerate the buildup of dead biomass because of this basal growth habit that they have. They don't do very well, and they become very moribund if they have this buildup of biomass. And really, when a fire moves through and takes all that away, they become much more vigorous again. And also there's evidence from the literature from savanna grasses that some species have fire-stimulated flowering and germination. So with those things in mind, I want to talk a little bit about some of my PhD work that kind of considers how grass communities might change under a changing fire frequency. So the first of the PhD chapters that I'll talk about is this piece of work where I've looked at associations between fire frequency and grass persistence strategy. And what I mean by these strategies is essentially how these populations survive through fire. So one is the resprouter strategy. So that is, as it says on the tin, these are the species that resprout from these basal meristems. And the other is the seeder strategy. So that is where the adult plants are killed in the fire, and persistence of these populations is through recruitment from the seed bank. And I expected that the relative benefit of these two strategies to vary over the range of fire frequencies experienced. And this had been looked at before in fire-prone woody taxa. So that is the top panel here kind of summarizes findings in woody taxa. But what I expected that these relationships would be different for grasses. So this bottom panel really shows the relationships that I'd predicted. And for resprouters, so that's the solid lines in this, I really expected quite a similar relationship between woody and grassy resprouters, with resprouters being reduced at very high and very low fire frequencies. So at very high, the cost of maintaining these storage organs becomes inviable. And at low fire frequencies, there is a real opportunity cost for investing resources in storage and not for growth right now when fire is rare. But I expected quite a different relationship for cedars. So that's the dashed line on these plots. And that is that they, so for woody species, they are susceptible to this immaturity risk. So that is going from germination to maturity is a longer time than the fire return interval. So as in they burn before they can reach maturity. But I didn't really expect that this would be the case for grassy cedars, because they can reach sexual maturity really quickly, so within months or even weeks. And I rather expected that as fire frequency becomes lower, then actually there may be other factors like increased competition from resprouters that really limits cedars in those fire regimes. So to look at these associations, what I did was collect data from on multiple things. So I collected data on whether a grass species was a resprouter or a cedar from the literature. And then I used some satellite-derived data sets to get species level data on fire frequency and intensity as well, although I won't talk about that in this talk. And then I did some phylogenetically controlled analysis to look at these associations between grass strategy and fire frequency. And what I found was that grass cedars were associated with more frequent fire than resprouters. So in this panel, we can see that the modal values of these two groups was quite similar. But really what's driving this pattern is that the cedars are really restricted in places, two places where fire is really frequent. So it kind of shows that this immaturity risk isn't really a factor for grassy cedars, but instead they may be restricted from places where fire is more rare through increased competition from resprouters. So thinking about this in the context of reduced fire frequency in savannas, then this suggests that we will see a reduction in these cedar species. For another PhD chapter, I looked at how changes in fire frequency are associated with changes in grass traits. So for this piece of work, I was fortunate to be able to sample plants of 4 savanna grass species from some experimental burn plots at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. And so I removed individuals from the annual burn plots and those that hadn't been burnt in the 35 years that these trials had been running. And so I removed these individuals from the plots. I brought them back to Rhodes University in South Africa where I was working, and reduced them to a certain number of tillers and then allowed these individuals to grow in a common environment for a year. And at this point, they look like this. And at this point, I took some measurements, so the number of flowering tillers that these individuals had, and I also did some destructive harvests to see how they were allocating biomass to it below and above ground. I then burnt all of these individuals, which was great fun, and then I tracked their regrowth over a month. And what I found was that these individuals really varied, sorry, these species really varied in terms of their traits, depending on what fire regime they had historically experienced. So I found that the plants that had been in the annual burn plots had 50% more flowering tillers than the no-burn plants, suggesting a greater investment in sexual reproduction. These annual burnt plants were also investing more of their total biomass below the ground, so this would be associated with better and more robust resprouting. And whilst I didn't find consistent differences across these 4 species in terms of their post-fire regrowth, what I did find was that for two of the 4 species, the annual burn plants produced significantly more biomass than the no-burn plants within that month of regrowth. I also did some population genetics to see if there was any genetic differentiation between the annual burn and no-burn treatments, and didn't find any. So really, what we see in these trait differences comes as a result of phenotypic plasticity. So it certainly seems that a reduced fire frequency, it doesn't eliminate this grassy layer, but it does lead to changes in the community in terms of traits and possibly the species present as well. And one thing to also consider at this point is flammability. So grasses, as I said, fuel these fires in savannas, and it's really their chemical and physical properties or their traits that really determines how flammable they are, and then that impacts on the fire behaviour in those places. Another of my PhD chapters really informs this area of research by determining what plant traits are responsible in driving differences in grass flammability. So for this piece of work, I used 25 savanna grasses in South Africa in the field, measured a number of chemical and physical traits that I thought would be influential to flammability. And then on the same individuals also measured a number of flammability components as well. So things like time to ignition and combustion rate. And what I found is that these 25 coexisting species differed substantially in the traits that I'd measured, and that these in turn were driving really big differences in all of these components of flammability that I'd measured. And what was really key in terms of traits was biomass moisture content and biomass quantity. So these were really the key traits that were driving these differences in these flammability components. So this suggests that if we're seeing changes in grass community in terms of traits, particularly if that's related to biomass moisture content and biomass quantity, then this will lead to changes in the flammability of these savannas. And whether that counteracts this reduction in fire frequency or amplifies it further isn't really understood at the moment, but it's definitely an area that requires further research. So that is what reduced fire frequency means for grasses. What does it mean for the trees in these landscapes? Well, essentially, it's a really good thing. Okay, so I mentioned that fire is a really significant demographic bottleneck. And yeah, if you decrease fire frequency, it means that more trees are able to reach maturity. And there's lots of evidence for this. So here's one. This is a modelling exercise led by William Bond. And he modelled, what would happen to the distribution of biomes if you turn fire off, and found that huge areas that are maintained as grassland and savannas become forested in the absence of fire. And similarly, even anecdotal evidence. So I showed this photo a few slides ago of these experimental burn plots that I'd used for my PhD. And you can really see, just eyeballing it from here, big differences in tree density from the no burn plots in contrast to those that are burnt annually. And furthermore, there's there might be a positive feedback as well with increased tree cover, further reducing landscape flammability. So we see with increasing tree cover, this reduces grass biomass through shading. This then impacts on the flammability of this fuel and has an impact of reducing fire frequency. And work done by Sally Archibald at Wits University in South Africa shows that there's really this threshold at 40% tree cover, beyond which fire becomes really rare or absent altogether. So let's just weigh up this evidence then for reduced fire frequency. So in terms of tree competitive ability, certainly this reduction in fire frequency is a really good thing for the trees. And whilst it might not have direct impacts on grass competition, it may be more, in that it might lead to changes in traits and the species present, but really this kind of indirect effect of increasing tree cover and shading out grasses is certainly, a decrease in grass competitive ability. Fires work at local rather than global scales. And this is a piece of counter evidence here, where we've got tree cover across a few decades, and we can see that this big increase in tree cover, and this is in South African savannas, with time, particularly over the last few decades, and that is regardless of the fire treatment that's imposed on these sites. So fire cannot completely explain what's going on here. So let's bring in then suspect 2, which is elevated CO2. And I mentioned earlier that savannas evolved under low atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And this means that they're currently experiencing the highest CO2 levels that they have in their whole history. So what impacts will that have on grass-tree coexistence? Well, the effects that it will have are largely due to differences in photosynthetic pathway between these two life forms. So for C3 trees, we know that they are carbon limited under current CO2 concentrations, and so they're likely to have a high growth response to elevated CO2. In contrast, C4 grasses have this carbon concentrating mechanism, which means that rubisco, the enzyme responsible for carbon fixation, exists in an atmosphere of elevated CO2 within the leaf. And so they are predicted to have a very low growth response to elevated CO2 because their photosynthesis is carbon saturated. So essentially they're unable to be carbon fertilized. And there's experimental evidence to back up these thoughts. So this is a piece of work that compared the growth of acacia, now Vachellia carew, which is a C3 tree, and Themeda triandra, which is a C4 savanna grass. And we can see on this figure that with increasing growth CO2, that the growth of the C3 tree increases, but the growth of the C4 grass remains unchanged and independent of CO2. There is evidence in the literature that C4 grasses may not be entirely unresponsive to elevated CO2. So this is a meta-analysis done quite a few years ago, but this suggested that that whilst we see on average a 33% increase in carbon assimilation in C3 grasses under elevated CO2, there is still a, this stimulatory effects in C4 grasses as well. It's less, but there is still something there. So that's again the evidence for elevated CO2. So this certainly increases tree competitive through carbon fertilization, and it certainly doesn't decrease grass competitive ability. It may have no effect or it may increase it. And atmospheric CO2 is something that is, having an impact on a global scale. So this alone can't really explain what's going on in savannas, because I showed this figure a few times now, but again, there's this huge spatial variability in encroachments. And if it was really just down to CO2, and that's kind of what historically people have thought was the impact in this case, if it was just CO2, we would see a much more consistent rate of encroachment across all areas. Okay, so with that, let's move on to suspect 3, which is water availability. Oh, sorry, I heard a voice then. And this accusation really comes from the observation that encroachment correlates with rainfall. So I showed you part of this graph earlier, showing this increase in tree cover through the recent decades, and that was for mesic savanna. But if we compare that to what's going on in semi-arid savanna, we can see that tree cover is being kept pretty low. And consistent with this is observations that encroachment is happening at a much faster rate in places in savannas with higher rainfall. So again, weighing up the evidence for this, we see that this high water availability certainly increases tree competitive ability. It certainly won't decrease grass competitive ability, in the sense that these are water limited environments seasonally, and so more water is a good thing for both of these life forms. This is something that works at local scales, but the changes that we see in encroachment aren't linked to changes in rainfall. So it really can't be something that is working on its own as a suspect. So what we think instead is that it's a co-suspect, so it's working alongside elevated CO2. And the reason for thinking that there's this interaction between CO2 and water availability is stomata. So these are the little pores on the surface of the leaf, and these are the site at both CO2 entry into the leaf and also the site of water loss from the leaf. And we know that stomata respond to elevated CO2, so they become smaller or fewer, or they just don't open as far. And this has an impact on transpiration and water loss from the leaves, and also therefore on water use efficiency as well. So high water use efficiency under elevated CO2. So what does this mean in terms of this interaction between CO2 and water availability? What does this mean for grass-tree coexistence? And the short answer is that we don't really know for sure. So there's some predictions that I'll talk about now, but really we need some more evidence. So first of all, for C4 grasses, we know when there's lots of water available, and the CO2 fertilization effect tends to be very low or non-existent. But when we move into very dry soils, there may be this CO2 fertilization effect with increased water use efficiency in these grasses, leading to much improved photosynthesis during droughts. And that is because when leaf water status falls, C4 photosynthesis becomes quickly inhibited. And in comparative work, C4 species show much greater reductions in photosynthesis during droughts than C3 species. It could alternatively just be that there's no CO2 fertilization. For C3 trees, we know that when there's lots of water available, they show this high CO2 fertilization effect. And whether this is maintained when soils dry out through increased water use efficiency, or if this fertilization effect goes away. And data from other C3 species suggests that elevated CO2 doesn't always lead to conserved soil water. That's not clear at the moment. So what we need in terms of this interaction between water and CO2 in driving encroachment is that more evidence is needed. And that segues nicely into the project that I'm working on at the moment, which is a NERC-funded project that aims to understand how rising CO2 interacts with water limitation to cause plant encroachment into savannas. And for part of this project, we're doing some experimental work at Rhodes University in South Africa, and we're doing some experimental work in these open top chambers where you can manipulate the CO2 concentration. And at the moment we're growing some grasses and trees in these chambers, and we're aiming to do lots of data collection over the next year. And I must give a big shout out at this point to these two people here, so to Bardi and Sarah, who are working very hard in these chambers under really hot conditions at the moment, collecting data, whilst I am stuck in the UK and unable to provide any practical help anyway. So big shout out to these two legends. And to give an overview of this experimental setup in these chambers, half of them are set to ambient CO2, the other half to elevated CO2. And within the chambers, the pots either have high water availability or low water availability. And we're also, the pots either have just the tree species in or the trees and grasses as well. So we're really trying to quantify the effect of grass competition here too. And another thing that we're hoping to unpick within this project is the role of plant functional traits in driving encroachment. And this comes from the observation that encroachment is not caused by a random sample of species present at a site, but really it's from particular species that consistently encroach across ecosystem types and climatic zones. So within these pots in the chambers, we're growing these species that are known to encroach, and also closely related species that don't encroach. And an example here is Vachellia tortilis, which is a big encroacher across much of Africa, paired with Vachellia areoloba, closely related species that doesn't encroach. And we really want to know what are the traits that are enabling these certain species to encroach and not others. In terms of this project, so I've not got any data to show today. This is still kind of early days for this, and we're very much in the window of data collection at the moment. So yeah, I look forward to being able to show some data from this project soon, but I won't be today. So to bring all this evidence together and weigh it up, let's first of all think of all the things I've spoken about in terms of impacts on trees in savannas first. So we know that reduced fire frequency is a really positive thing for these savanna trees. It allows more of these individuals to reach maturity. We also know that elevated CO2 has a positive effect on photosynthesis of these trees, and there's this CO2 fertilization effect. Elevated CO2 also has an impact on water use efficiency. And one thing we're really keen to unpick in this current project is how that interacts with water availability. So seeing if we can try and explain why we see this gradient of encroachment with rainfall in savannas. And the other thing that we don't know that we want to is the role of traits in these tree species and how they cause encroachment or allow encroachment and how they interact with these various factors. From the grass perspective, so reduced fire frequency might not have really direct negative impacts in the sense that it might lead to changes in traits and the species present in communities, but really it's having a negative effect that's mediated through this response on trees and their kind of positive feedback that they have on fire regimes as well, and by shading out these grasses. The impact of elevated CO2 on the photosynthetic ability of these grasses is somewhat unclear. You know, the photosynthesis may be carbon saturated. Some evidence suggests that it's not, and they may have some positive effect on these grasses. And what's more likely happening with these grasses is that there is a positive effect of this elevated CO2 on water use efficiency, and this is really feeding into a CO2 fertilization effect in these grasses. And again, we want to know or want to unpick further how water availability interacts with this elevated CO2. And some work that I'm doing at the moment with Carla Staver at Yale. We've got some grass biomass data sets that goes back several decades, and we really want to see whether we can see, you know, this signature of increasing C4 grass biomass, yeah, see if we can see this kind of this effect of CO2. We can't talk about grasses without thinking about their flammability and the effects that that has on fire regimes as well. And what's particularly interesting, and this is some work that Sarah is working on at the moment at Rhodes, is the impact of elevated CO2 and the effect that has on grass flammability. So potential increases in grass biomass and increases in biomass moisture content as well through increased water use efficiency. And one thing that I've not mentioned since the first few slides is herbivory and the impact of changing herbivore regimes on encroachment. So we know these herbivory regimes are changing, and we're seeing reductions in browsers and increasing numbers of grazers. And this has the impact of having a positive impact on the trees and a further negative impact on the grasses. And work that Nicholas Stevens and others have done have really showed that the presence of elephants is really important in the context of stopping encroachment, or at least reducing the rate of encroachment. So as you can see from this figure, there's many question marks still on this kind of web of interactions. And so I can't really bring this case to a nice clean end, and I can't really completely close it because there is a lot that we still don't know. But certainly all of these factors are likely contributing to encroachment in savannas. So just to give a few kind of closing notes on this case. So it seems that savannas are victim to a perfect storm of climate and land use changes. And these are really threatening the very existence of this biome through altering this delicate balance between grasses and trees. And that we really need a better understanding of these complex interactions between these abiotic and biotic factors in order to predict the future of savanna ecosystems. So with that, and with time in mind, I won't read out all these people's names, but all of these people on this slide contributed to my PhD thesis and the project that I'm postdocing on at the moment. And with that, I would like to say thanks for having me. And yeah, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kim. That was fascinating. Please, yeah, if you have a question, raise your hand using the function, and I will call you out. While we wait, I have a quick question. So yeah, I'm interested in the grazing component, because you mentioned at the start that that was maybe a driver of why there's reduced fire, right? So I'm because superficially they seem to be doing similar things. They're both sort of defoliation processing, right? So yeah, defoliation processes. So so what are the differences between how grazing and fire affects the ecosystem in this?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so you're right. They functionally they do really similar things in terms of they cause defoliation of the grasses that fuel, but the grasses in the herbaceous layer. I guess the difference is in terms of encroachment is that yeah, there's this interaction. So where grazing is high, fire is less of an issue, and vice versa. But with fire, you know, that is really responsible for killing these trees. And I guess, I mean, I think both herbivory and fire are, as I say, both contributing to this demographic bottleneck. But yeah, I think fire, yeah, grazing. So as I say, these herbivory regimes are changing. So it's much more you know, increases in grazers, particularly livestock, and much less so for browsers. So you know, browsers, particularly, you know, big mega herbivore browsers are being reduced in terms of in numbers and densities, and they're really what impacts on the survival of these trees in these landscapes, whereas grazing is really the grass layer. So yeah, a reduction in browsing is contributing to this, whereas grazing is doing something different. But you're quite right that grazing and fire are two kind of opposing, two very similar processes in these landscapes.
No, thanks. That's well explained. Right, Pat has a raised hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a nice talk. Am I right in sort of assuming that both of these things, like the stomata sensitivities and also, or the stomata linked water sensitivities, and also the fire, you know, that presumably they're very poorly represented in models, and I wondered if that's correct. Can we use past climate as any indications for this, or are human influences on the ecosystem so large that really past proxies can't tell us anything useful?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I suspect, as you say, that maybe yeah, representation within models maybe isn't good enough at the moment. I think we can look back, obviously in terms of CO2 concentrations and kind of see what's happened historically, to kind of inform how things may change going forward. And I mentioned that looking at work I'm doing, looking at grass biomass data sets, and okay, it only goes over the last few decades, but really encroachment has been happening for it's been happening for a long time, and some of the graphs I've shown show this really big increase in the last few decades, but certainly our knowledge can be informed by what's gone before, because this has been a process that's been going on for a long time. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I hope I've said something that's useful.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks again for a really nice talk. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. Yes, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I think Tim just got in before Stephen, so I'll ask Tim's question. Tim asks, what are believed to be the main drivers for the reduced fire frequency that's driving this? Yeah,
so I think so really it's to do with habitat fragmentation and the conversion of land to cropland or really high grazing pressure. And they all have the impact of either just reducing the fuel load or impacting on the continuity of these fuels as well. So essentially, when you do have a fire, there's less fuel to fuel the fire, and also it's not as well connected. So again, a smaller area is being burnt, but really, yeah, it's human activity, and fire suppression in places as well. Yeah, humans are really altering these fire regimes in savannas for sure.
Sorry, thanks, Kim. Stephen, do you want to ask your question live or use in the chat?
Okay, great. Thanks very much for a lovely talk. I've just got one question. Is there any role of nutrients in any of these trends? Because I just noticed I was looking at the Jardine paper where I think leaf nitrogen is high in some of these areas of southern Africa, which seems to coincide with the areas of lower woody encroachment, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think there is a big role of nutrients, and I feel like from the reading that I've done that this is not well understood in the context of encroachment in savannas, but certainly so the ability to this carbon fertilization effect of trees and potentially grasses as well is really limited by the availability of other nutrients as well. So like nitrogen in your example. So you would expect, and there's data from various face experiments that have gone on that show, if you're limited in other things, so like nitrogen, you don't see this, the same extent in carbon fertilization, and that makes sense. You've got to be limited by something. So I think, yeah, I definitely think there is a role for nutrient availability in this. And yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to explore that further and see, compare soil fertility with rates of encroachment. And maybe it's been done. I've not read it, but I certainly think that there must be something there. Evidence from face experiments certainly suggests it.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Any other questions from the group? If not, then I have another one.
Yeah, go for it.
Right, so I'm always, something I always struggle to get my head around in assessing the impact of fire on ecosystems is some natural fire versus anthropogenic fire. And I guess once it's burning, it may not be that much of a distinction. I know they're hard to tell apart, but maybe there are differences in the timing of when one happens compared to the other. So yeah, do you have any kind of perspective on the relative roles of those two in this phenomenon? Have they both been declining?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Anthropogenic fire is, is increasingly making up a bigger proportion of fires that happen in these ecosystems. And I mean, I guess you would predict that there may be differences in timing. So obviously, for human-driven fire, it's just whenever they go out and set the fires, right? But natural fires may be, well, I guess they could be more variable in that it's very responsive to, extreme weather events or just really the dry season in these environments. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'd probably know more about that in other ecosystems. So like the fire seasons that we have in the UK, I think they really differ, from setting fires in moorlands versus to wildfires that we might get in the summer in those ecosystems. But I would guess in a lot of these savannas, those two things probably coincide a lot more in terms of the fire season and when people are also just trying to clear all this dead biomass, which also happens at the same time. That those two things coincide much more in savanna environments. So I don't think. Yeah, so I think maybe the nature of the fire is not so different because, as you say, like once they're burning. But yeah, I think certainly the frequency is what's changing. So
yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I was thinking in terms of the sort of early season and late season fires that people have been setting in, I guess in more sort of forest environments. But anyway, yeah, thank you. Right, Tim has another question. Please go ahead.
Hi, Kimberley. Thanks very much. Great talk. I just overall for the sense of planetary health, how much savanna can we afford to lose? I mean, we're losing forests as well, and in a way, it seems, all right, a bit more savanna becomes full of trees. I know it's not very good for the local savanna ecosystem, but overall on a planetary scale, what effect is this going to have? And is it a sort of natural, in some ways, a natural adaptation to what's going on with the rest of the planet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very good point, and I don't really feel like I can answer that particularly well. I guess, yeah. I mean, I think, part of this is, as you say, is a natural response to these different. These different factors, these anthropogenic driven factors. In terms of, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that question particularly well. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, in terms of planetary health, yeah, there's more tree cover. Whether that makes up for loss of trees elsewhere, I guess you could argue that. But yeah, I guess from my perspective, is you're changing. Yeah, it's just the change of these biomes and the implications that that I spoke about for local people and endemic wildlife. But yeah, I guess if you were kind of viewing it as a whole, global thing, is that you could say it's counteracting loss of woody cover elsewhere.
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. So we're at time. So if anyone needs to head off, then please do. Thank you for coming. But Kim, if you could stay for a couple more minutes, we have one more question from Lena.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you for a very nice presentation. My background is on vegetation modeling and plant physiology. And I was in a meeting in South Africa not long ago, and then I saw all the elephants removing the trees. The scientists were quite happy, Sally
Yes.
and William. And then we were discussing how to improve vegetation modelings of Savannah. And then I remain wondering, do we need to include the elephants in our models? What do you think is their relative role?
Yeah, so from the work that I've seen, and maybe you know Nikki Stevens, but the work that she's done has really informed this. But yeah, if when you can see, you can really see differences in rates of encroachment in areas where there are elephants present and areas where you've still got quite an intact herbivore population, herbivore community, but elephants aren't there. And even within the context of protected areas, you can really see these differences. So elephants are, as you say, like they physically can knock quite big these trees over and really disrupt them, and there's nothing else that is able to do that in these ecosystems. So yeah, if you could include data on elephant density in models, then I guess yeah, definitely include the elephants. That's what Tim said. Yeah, I think they really are having an impact, and yeah, it'd be really cool if you could kind of restore some of these places just with elephants. It would be a neat.
They are increasing in some of the places as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Some
yeah.
of the parks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you could spread those out and kind of yeah, do it in that way, that would be really cool. But yeah, elephants are really important, which is just a really neat thing. So yeah. Cool.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Kim, for coming and sharing your work with us.
It's been my pleasure.
Really great talk and really good discussion. Yeah, please stay in touch with us at the GSI.
Yeah, I will do. Great. Well, thank you all so much, and thanks for your very interesting questions and points raised. And yeah, thanks, Guy, for chairing. And yeah, I will be. Yeah, all my details were on the first slide, but just if anyone else has any other questions, just please feel free to get in touch. So cool.
Great, thanks. And as always,